This week, I want to talk about the topic, out of your control. Have you ever felt like things were completely and totally outside of your control? Maybe you saw just a second ago, we have a theme this year where it's called Eternal Perspective, and we have a Bible verse that's kind of gone along with that. And our Bible verse is 2 Corinthians 4, verse 18, and it says this, you can see up here on the screen. So we don't focus on what is seen, we focus on what's unseen. For what's seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And as I was thinking about this week, I was thinking about our passage that we'll be looking at today. There's nothing like a good trial in your life to take your eyes off what's eternal. Nothing like let a good trial happen in your life. And your eyes go from maybe very spiritual things to now maybe you are just in go mode. Maybe you are just in survival mode. I don't know if you've ever heard of the book. We'll put the picture of it up here on the screen. Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. Have you heard of this book? Have you heard of this? Maybe you read this to your kids as they were growing up. Well, this week it wasn't Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. This week I had a day, and I think God was prepping me for this. It was Pastor Dan and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. One day this week, I had a situation where the battery went out on my car. And I had some things happen before, but I didn't think much of it because, your kids get in your car. If you have young kids like I do, they'll get in there and they'll just start pushing buttons. And they'll push that dome light and you don't notice it. And then you come out the next day to go to work and you crank and it doesn't crank. So there would have been some dome lights on and things like that. So I didn't think much of it. We jumped it off. But after I gotten everything set up, man, it's still, my wife, we actually walked out the front door at the same time that particular day, and I can see her going down the road as my car is going click, 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 click. Nothing was happening. So that was kind of the start of it. And then later on what had happened in the day, it was a busy day, lots of things that were going on. And so I came back home that afternoon, and I don't know, I've talked to y'all in the past about my dogs. I've got 2 dogs, and they're not ferocious. They just don't realize that they're big, okay? They think they're lap dogs, but they're not. And so they don't realize. So what we did is we decided to keep them in a shed. So they're in a shed throughout the day so they can shed all day if they want to, and it's not in the house. And so we put in air conditioning in there. And so let me tell you, they've got the Taj Mahal as far as they're concerned. They have a great time. But I came that afternoon and I opened up the door. I was going to let them go out, let them use the restroom, all that kind of stuff. And then, but I look at it, I'm like, man, it's really hot in here. In fact, it was 100 degrees in there. The air conditioner had frozen up. So here I am, my battery's messed up. And then I almost killed my dogs. Don't report me to PETA or anything like that. So I almost had that. And then later on, my kid comes home and we're getting ready. Lately we've been doing this thing where we do homework and we'll go down to a little coffee shop. We'll get a donut and something. And then my oldest daughter, will start doing homework. Well, this particular day, I don't know why, but we got the great idea that just bring the whole family. Let's just bring the whole family. And so we ate dinner a little early and we were going to go there. And so we get in the coffee shop, we purchase everything, we're getting ready to sit down, and then all of a sudden, my youngest just lets it all out. Sick as can be, poor little thing, and you just want to take it from them, all that kind of thing. And so it was just one of those days, and on top of that, I had a million irons in the fire of just being so busy. And I'm going to be honest with you, I got frustrated with God. I got frustrated because I pray every morning for my girls. I pray for our family. I pray for their protection. I pray for their health. I pray for their day, all of that. And I'll be honest with you, I kind of felt at the end of this particular day this week, I was like, God, I feel like you've abandoned me. Because here I was praying, I was seeking your face, and later on, after I kind of cooled down, because after you've had a day like that, you just kind of want to cool down. You just want to go, just kind of get your thoughts, all that. Later, after I kind of cooled down, I was able to hear his voice, and he said this to me. He said, Dan, I didn't abandon you. I was testing you. And let me tell you, I was like, oh man. Because there were things and reactions that had happened in that day that I was not very proud of. He said, I heard your prayers. And he reminded me of the time that when Jesus was walking on the water and Peter pipes up when he sees him. They're all kind of scared. And he said, Peter essentially says to him, I want to walk on the water too. And Jesus says, come on, get out of the boat. So Peter begins to walk on the water, and Jesus has called him out there. And the Bible says in Matthew chapter 14, he says, when Peter saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and he began to sink. At the end of the day, what happened was Peter took his eyes off of Jesus and he started putting it on the wind and the waves. And your wind and my wind and waves might not look like water, might not look like air as we're we're not in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, but they might be frozen air conditioners and dead car batteries and your baby barfing in the middle of a restaurant. It might look like that. When we take our eyes, and this reminded me, I put this quote in your notes of a pastor in California. His name is Buddy Owens. And just thought this was so fitting for what we're going to talk about today. He said this, when you fix your thoughts on God, God fixes your thoughts. Isn't that true? When you're in the midst of a trial, when you're in the midst of everything that's going on, when you fix your thoughts on God, God fixes your thoughts. And what we find all over Scripture is that when things feel like they're out of control, they're never really out of God's control. You do know that. Now, they might feel it, and we're reminded that our faith isn't driven by our feelings. It's not. Our faith is driven by our trust in the Lord. And we see in the life of Paul in today's story of him, he's traveling to Rome. This is what God has called him to do. God has called him to go to Rome. He is exactly in the perfect will of God. Have you ever said, God, I'm doing this for you. I'm going in the right direction. And maybe God has laid this on your heart that, that you have been called to turn your life around. Maybe you're here today and you're saying, man, I'm trying to come back to church. And I'm just going to let you know that even when you try to turn your life around and you're trying to go back in the direction of Jesus, you're trying to go back in the direction of holiness and purity and do things right because you know that's what God has called you to do. You know that's what He blesses. There's going to be times that He allows you to go through that storm and be tested. So don't be surprised if you're trying to turn your life around or have God turn your life around when He tests you and when things feel like they're out of control. And so today I want you to turn with me to the book of Acts, chapter 27. We are getting close to the end of our Acts sermon series. And so we're going to be in Acts chapter 27. We're going to be here in verse 9. And today is a fascinating passage. We're going to be talking about Paul going through a shipwreck. And this is interesting as we kind of walk through this. Even just as a little side note, there's many secular scholars, are not Christians, who have actually said that the passage that we're going to be looking at today is actually one of the most data-rich examples of what sailing looked like in the ancient world. We don't have a lot of, examples of people. We knew that they sail. We knew that cargo would go from one place to another, but, they didn't really write down exactly, how it happened or what happened and the different methods that they used. And so even secular scholars say this is data rich. We have learned so much about sailing and wrecking through this particular passage that we're going to be studying today. And so I just want to pick up right here in verse 9, and it says this. It says, by now much time had passed, and the voyage was already dangerous. They were trying to get themselves to Rome. You got to remember the Apostle Paul had been arrested. He was going to go to Rome in chains. And they're trying to get there, but there's different seasons that you would go sailing. And this one has already passed that particular time. It says, since the Day of Atonement was already over, Paul gave his advice and told them, men, I can see that this voyage is headed towards disaster and heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives. But the centurion paid attention to the captain and the owner of the ship rather than what Paul said. So you have a centurion who is a leader in the Roman military, and he is in charge of not just the Apostle Paul, but he's in charge of several prisoners, and he's trying to get these guys to Rome. But then you also have a captain. And so Paul, who's low man on the totem pole, is saying, this isn't a good idea. But the captain is saying, nah, we can make this. We can do this. And so the centurion listens to the captain rather than Paul. And then in verse 12, it says, since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided to set sail from there, hoping somehow to reach Phoenix. By the way, it's not Phoenix, Arizona, but reach Phoenix. I'll show you that one here in just a second. A harbor on Crete facing the southwest and northwest, and to winter there. So I've put some maps on the back of your notes, and we'll also kind of put them up here on the screen. And so here's where they are. They're right here at Fair Havens, and they're trying to make their way to the other side of the island of Crete and to Phoenix, because there was a good port there in which they could go in and ride out the winter. And so they're going to try to make it there. For ancient sailing vessels, travel was problematic and dangerous from about mid-September to mid-November. Kind of think of yourself as like hurricane season. You know how we hold our breath during hurricane season? We're just, all right, what's going to happen? That kind of thing. So they knew the times that were good and the times that were not good in order to sail. And so all sailing in the open sea ceased from mid-November, at least into February. And so he mentions here the Day of Atonement. And so the Day of Atonement typically falls, it's a different place each year, kind of like Easter is a different day each year. So the Day of Atonement typically falls usually at the end of September or in early October. And so what Paul is saying is, this is the dangerous season. We are right in the middle of, if you will, hurricane season. And I know you're just trying to get to the other side of the island, but this is not a good idea. Now, here's the point that I want to make. It's not in your notes, but I think that it's important. That we see Paul speaking up, but he's ignored. He's ignored. And I think this is important, because Paul was doing everything God wanted him to do. And you would think, quite literally, that everything would be smooth sailing. But it wasn't. He's ignored. And here's the point that I want to make to you this morning. There are going to be times in your life that you feel ignored. Don't take it personally. It's part of the test. It's part of the test. There are going to be times that you feel ignored. And so certainly Paul was in the very middle of the will of God. He's doing exactly what he needs to, but nevertheless, he was ignored. Let's go on to verse 13 and kind of see what continues to happen. In verse 13, it says this, when a gentle south wind sprang up. Oh, doesn't that sound nice? Gentle south wind sprang up. They thought they had achieved their purpose. They weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. But before long, a fierce wind called a northeaster rushed down from the island. And since the ship was caught and unable to head into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Verse 16. After running under the shelter of a little island called Cauda, we were barely able to get control of the skiff. That's the small boat, And so that they had a small boat that was a part of the larger boat. And then in verse 17, after hoisting it up, they used ropes and tackle and girded the ship, fearing that they would run aground on Syrtis. They lowered the drift anchor, and in this way they were driven along. Because we were severely battered by the storm, they began to jettison the cargo the next day. On the third day, we were just trying to go to the other side of the island. Now we're on day 3. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. For many days, neither sun nor stars appeared, and the severe storm kept raging. Finally, all hope was fading that we would be saved. And so I want us to see that now things are getting real. Things are getting bad. And I hope that you are never on a boat in the middle of the Mediterranean, in the middle of a storm. But one thing that I do know is that you will go through the storms of life. And in the storms of life, there will be situations that occur, and you will feel out of control. You'll feel that way. And so today, my sermon is brought to us by the letter E. So if you get any other note this morning that doesn't have an E in it, then you've got it wrong. But I want to just write down just a few things as we move through this passage today. When situations occur and you feel out of control, get your notes and your pen ready. Number one, write this down. Endure hardship. Endure hardship. Now, I want to make sure that you hear what I'm saying and what I'm not saying, okay? I'm not saying pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Okay? But what I am saying is that make sure your mind is fixed. In the book of James, chapter 1, verse 12, the people of Jerusalem were going through a real struggling time. And James writes, and this is what he says to them. He says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial." That he's enduring even in the midst of that trial. Now look at this. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life. Talk about that eternal perspective. The crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. Over and over and over throughout the scriptures, we see this. Persevere, endure, remain steadfast. And even above all that, look at the very first word. I didn't underline it, but the very first word here is blessed. I don't know about you, but when everything's falling apart in my day this week, I didn't feel too blessed. Do you? Blessed is the man. Blessed when you're tempted, when you're tested, you're blessed. And the reality is, like an athlete who competes, they strain through the pain in order to win the prize. I saw on social media this past week, there was several kids that their parents had posted pictures of them in their first cross-country meet. And some of them had dealt with some rain. I love running in the rain. I think it's awesome. But they were posting pictures of their first cross-country meet. And that resonated in my heart because I ran cross-country when I was in high school. But every time, we would practice, it was no big deal. But whenever we ran a race, I don't know what it was. I would be out there running and this thought would go through my mind. What am I doing? This is so painful. And then it was only after I crossed the finish line that it all made sense. It all made sense. When I crossed the finish line and you said, yes, I finished. I did it. The next time you go through a trial, and it might be this week, say out loud, I'm running through the tape. I am winning the prize. Keep your thoughts on the end. And I want to encourage you, remain level-headed. Don't let your emotions take over. My wife, who's a counselor, tells me all the time, said your emotions are there to inform you, not to control you. And so when you notice that your emotions are beginning to control you rather than inform you, okay, I'm angry. Why am I angry? Because there's been injustice. It's informing me. I'm dealing with anxiety or depression. Why am I feeling that way? Okay, there's a situation that's been going on. By the way, if you deal with depression is simply this. It is anger turned inward. That's it. That's what depression is. So don't let your emotions control you. Let your emotions inform you. And you endure hardship. Okay, number 2. When situations occur and you feel out of control, number 2, I want you to see this, encourage others. Encourage others. Let's look at verse 21. It says this in verse 21. It says, since then they had been without food for a long time. Paul then stood up among them and said, you men should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss. Now, by the way, Paul is not just like getting his digs in, okay? Sometimes we do that. I want to make sure that we say, well, the Apostle Paul got his digs in, so, my husband and wife, they didn't listen to me. I'm going to try to get my digs in. That's not the point, okay? The point is this. The point is this. He's just simply saying, listen, you didn't listen to me the first time. How about you listen to me now, okay? In verse 22, it says, now I urge you to take courage because there will be no loss of any of your lives, but only the ship. Let me tell you, when you're in the midst of the storm and someone says you're not going to lose your life, ship, we might lose it, but you're not going to lose your life. In fact, skip down to verse 25 real quick. I want you to see his encouraging words. So he says this in verse 25, so take courage, men, because I believe God that it will be just as the way it was told to me, but we have to run aground on some island. He's telling them to take up courage. He's telling them to be courageous. And this is so important because when you're going through a trial, listen to me, the easiest thing is to become a complainer. The easiest thing for you to do is to become a complainer. And you have to be aware that your mouth and my mouth are like a sharp knife. And your mouth can even, if it's like a sharp knife, it can either be used as a weapon, like a sword, to kill and to strike, or your mouth can be used like a scalpel to bring about healing, to bring about cutting out things like fear, hurt, insecurity in others. Your mouth can be used to repair. So let me ask you this. When you go through the trial and you begin to think of your mouth, is your mouth a sword or is your mouth a scalpel? Does it bring about beatings or does it bring about healing? Paul, even in the midst of this, he's using his mouth to bring about repair. He's encouraging others. I think some Christians are tempted to use and wield their words like an axe murderer. And the reality is, when you go through those trials, you can also be an encourager. Notice Paul doesn't shy away from the truth like we talked about in verse 21. Okay, you should have listened to me. But he uses his words to build the men up. And I want to encourage you to have those types of conversations this week. I want you to ask, how can I contribute to this person and build them up? Might be your husband, might be your wife, might be your coworker, might be your kids. But even in the midst of that, how can you use your words to build that person up, even in the middle of the trial? Now, don't lie and don't use flattery. Instead, speak life into the people that you're around this week. And can I just remind you, I mentioned children earlier. Can I just remind you of something? Your kids pick up on it quick. I'm around people's kids that are negative or disrespectful, and I'm like, where did that come from? It came from mom or it came from dad. But if you're an encourager, your kids will pick up on that as well. And this happens in so many different forms. I don't want to, belay this, but I actually have a lady. I was debating whether or not I would tell you this, but I have a lady who is the grandmother of a former employee who used to work here at Memorial. Most of y'all don't even know who it was. But she is the grandmother of a former employer, of an employee that used to be here. And she texts me, sends me a Facebook message every Sunday at like 5 a.m. She says, I'm praying for you. I'm praying for you. I'm praying for the word that's going to come out of your mouth. I look forward to it. I've never met her in person, but let me tell you, I long for those encouraging words because you know what? There are weeks that are really hard, and I look forward to that message on Sunday mornings. I don't know about you, but when people write cards, like encouraging notes and things like that, I keep them. Do you keep them? I keep them because that bad day is going to come, and it's super nice when you have that note that you can go back to, or that Facebook message, or that text message that you can go back to. I want to encourage you to encourage others, even in the midst of your own storm. Well, that leads us right into number 3. Number 3, when situations occur and you feel out of control, write this down. Emphasize God's purpose. Emphasize God's purpose. What do I say to others to build them up? Emphasize God's purpose. Emphasize God's plan. Let's go back just a second. Let's go back to verse 23. I kind of skipped over it. It says, for last night, this is Paul talking. He's talking to the folks. He said, for last night, the angel of God as I belong to and serve stood by me. And he said, don't be afraid, Paul. It is necessary for you to appear before Caesar. And indeed, God has graciously given you all those who are sailing with you. So here, he's speaking into them. How does he use encouraging words? Yes, he says, be of good courage. We talked about that. But he's also saying, guys, the God that I serve, he has a purpose, he has a plan, and guess what? You're part of it. And he speaks into that. So many times in the midst of that trial, here's what happens. We take our eyes off God's purpose for our life. Let me give you a great illustration. There's a pastor who had a man in his church who was just focused on all the wrong things. Sometimes it happens. He was focused on the style of music. He was overly critical of the budgets. He was overly critical of how the church was being run. And the teenagers of the church, they did this little worship service once a month. They would go to the nursing home and just love on the people there. But they needed a ride. Their parents would bring them to the church, and so then the van would leave out from the church. And so the pastor said to himself, he said, you know what? I want to get this guy to think more missionally. I want him to think more about God's purpose. And so he wanted to emphasize God's purpose in this particular man's life. And so he emphasized God's purpose. And he said, I tell you what, why don't you drive these teenagers to the nursing home, stay there while they do their thing, and then you drive them back. And so that's exactly what he did. Now he went there and the kids are, doing their worship service, and, the older folks are really enjoying it, all of that. What's he doing? He's back in the back. He's got his arms crossed throughout the service. Lo and behold, as he was sitting there thinking, man, what am I doing here? An older gentleman came up to him in a wheelchair, didn't say anything to him, but just reached out and held his hand. Well, now he's kind of mad because men don't hold hands, okay? We don't like holding hands. And he's like, man, this is awkward. And this guy is holding my hand. And, and he held it throughout the whole service. And at the end of the service, he let go. And the gentleman who was part of the church got all the teenagers, put them back in the van, and came back. Well, this happened a second week. And this happened a third week. He comes there. He sits for the worship service. Old man wheels up to him, puts his hand in his hand. He's a little weirded out by it. But every continuous week, he kind of got used to it, that kind of thing. On the fourth week, he went there and the older gentleman who had come up to hold his hand wasn't there. So the man asked one of the nurses who was there, he said, where is this older gentleman? He's here. He's always here. He's holding my hand. She said, he's not doing good. You need to stop by his room. And so he went and he found out the particular room number. And so he went and found the room that he was at. And then as he walked in, he could see all kinds of, tubes and cords and everything were hanging out. And so he went over to the man, and this time he reached out and held his hand. He just felt like it was the right thing to do. About that time, an older woman came in and she made this comment. She said, he's been waiting for you. He's been waiting for you. He told us over and over that he just wanted to hold the hand of Jesus one more time before he passed. People get so focused on trivial things. And it's up to us, like that pastor that simply redirected their thinking. And that man's life was never the same. All because someone encouraged him to be missional about God's purposes instead of his own. Can I encourage you to redirect someone's thinking this week? Maybe everything is negative, but I want to encourage you, redirect their thinking. You can do it. Emphasize God's purpose, even in the midst of your trial. Okay, I got to be quick. We got to go to the next thing. When a situation occurs and you feel out of control, number 4, engage impulsive behavior. Now, this is kind of interesting. Engage impulsive behavior. Look at verse 27. In verse 27, it says, when the 14th night came, we were drifting in the Adriatic Sea. And about midnight, the sailors thought that we were approaching land. As they took soundings and found it to be 120 feet deep. So essentially what they're doing is they're dropping a rope. They're trying to find out how far deep the water is. And so they're taking these soundings, so it's 120 feet deep. And when they had sailed a little farther and sounded again, they found it to be 90 feet deep. And then, fearing that we might run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight to come. Now, don't miss this. Impulsive. Some sailors tried to escape from the ship. They had let down the skiff into the sea, pretending that they were going to put out anchors from the bow. So essentially, they're being deceitful. Verse 31, it says this, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut the ropes holding the skiff and let it drop away. So we're going to put this map up here on the screen so you can see they are just drifting. They are out in the open sea. They've come through the Adriatic Sea. And here's the thing that I want us to see is that one of the greatest hindrances to the gospel of Jesus Christ is impulsive behavior. Okay? God had a deal with these sailors. Stay together or everyone drowns. And so by staying together, they were acting upon their faith, but by using that skiff that they were going to try to escape on, they were reacting impulsively to their fear. And we have to remember that when we act impulsively, there are many times we're not in God's will. Now, don't get me wrong, you have to react sometimes quickly, but not impulsively. And here, what they try to do is they try to escape. And Paul says, it's not going to work. Perhaps you have a good friend who has gotten into a relationship because there's a hole in their life. Maybe they've been through a personal storm. And you can see clearly that other person doesn't love God. Maybe they would even be unequally yoked. But they're longing for companionship. You and I have an opportunity to speak into that. We can speak into that. Perhaps you have a good friend or a family member and they're going through a trial and you hear them and they're talking about spending money or they're talking about doing a drug or they're talking about going out. And you can look them in the eye and say, I care about you. And yes, you're a grown man. And yes, you're a grown woman. But this is dangerous. At any time, any one of us is susceptible to temptation. But especially so when we go through a storm. We are especially susceptible to temptation when we are in the midst of something. And we want the pain to stop, even if it's just for a second. And sometimes we're tempted to do something impulsively. And this is where you turn your eyes to Jesus and you say, okay, Lord, I'm going to imitate Jesus. Hebrews 12, verse 3, look at it up here on the screen. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. How do I stay focused? Jesus did it for you, so you can do it for him. This is talking about Jesus hanging on the cross, and at any point, he could have impulsively stopped the pain, called on a legion of angels, but he endured the cross to the very end. And if he endured it for you out of love, you can endure it for him out of love as well. Last thing. when a situation occurs and you feel out of control, number 5, exercise common sense. Exercise common sense. Look at verse 33. It says, when it was about daylight, Paul urged them all to take food. They needed to eat, saying, today is the 14th day. That's 2 weeks that they have been on the open water, that you have been waiting and going without food, having eaten nothing. Verse 34, so I urge you to take some food, for this is for your survival, since none of you will lose a hair from your heads. After he said these things and they had taken some bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them. And after he broke it, he began to eat, and they were all encouraged, and they took some food themselves. And in all, there were 276 of us on this ship. Wow. This is no small boat of people. 276. Here he is. Guys, you got to eat. Verse 38, when they had eaten enough, he began to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard into the sea. Can I be honest with you? This note almost sounds unspiritual. It really does. Exercise common sense. But as a Christian, in the midst of a storm, God is calling you to be the most level-headed person in the room. He is. To know when things feel out of control that He's in control. And to know that, yes, there is a spiritual side, but there is also a practical side. Maybe you've heard that poem. Do you remember how that poem goes? If you can keep your head when others are losing theirs, you will be a man, my son. And he tells the sailors, you got to eat. Because sometimes, listen to me, sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do in the midst of a crisis is also the most practical. Yes, pray. Yes, plan. Yes, talk to others. But you've got to be practical. And when you go through the fire and when you go through the storm and you just can't go any further, ask yourself simple questions. Have I eaten today? Have I slept well? Have I exercised? Have I had a shower? Those things are important. Have I put up healthy boundaries when I'm around and surrounded by unhealthy people? Let me tell you something. A lot of depression, anxiety, and even things like anger and hostility can go back to practical things. So make those practical things a priority when you are in crisis. And here's what I find. If you will make time for the practical, then you won't be forced to make time for the detrimental. If you had just taken time for the practical, then you won't be forced to make time for the detrimental. And so let's see what happens to Paul when he exercises this common sense. Let's finish it out in verse 39. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but sighted a bay with a beach. They planned to run the ship ashore if they could, and after cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea at the same time, loosening the ropes that had held the rudders. And they hoisted the foresail to the wind and headed for the beach. Verse 41, but they struck a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow jammed fast and remained immovable, while the stern began to break up by the pounding of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that they could not swim away and escape. They would do that because if you let a prisoner go and they got away, that was on you if you were a soldier. If you let your prisoner get away, then that's your life. So they're planning on just killing them. That's bad for Paul, by the way. Verse 43, but the centurion kept them from carrying out their plan because he wanted to save Paul. And so he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to follow, some on planks, some on debris from the ship. In this way, listen to this. Look how God worked in the midst of their situation. Everyone safely reached the shore. Everyone reached the shore. Now, as I was reading this week, I ran across a story that I thought was pretty interesting as we close in our time together. There was another shipwreck, more modern, that had happened recently. And there was someone who had caught, a little boy was caught in this huge storm. And so the boy that was on the ship was taken by the waves. And he eventually just found this rock close to land. And he just hugged this rock. And he stayed on this rock and he hugged it. And he was shivering. He was cold. He was scared. All of those things. And later on, as dawn approached the next day, a rescue boat came out and found him the next morning. And they asked him later on, a news reporter asked him later on, said, "Weren't you scared? Weren't you cold?" And the boy said, "Yes, I was scared. I shook all night long, but the rock I was holding on to did it." Our rock is Jesus Christ. And things in life will feel out of control. People will lose their heads when they are around you. But remember this, hold on to Jesus. Maybe you don't remember any of these 5 points. That's okay. Remember one, hold on to Jesus. He is your rock.